Tom, let me ask you a question. Is Pop skating in this? He is the face of the organization. He is the guy that stands up. Remember, famously stood up for against a lot of the terrible rhetoric coming out of Trump and Trump apologists and all that in a notoriously red state, for an ownership group that is notoriously red itself. Pop has been long regarded as, what Kate was referring to earlier, like this super progressive guy. He is the most important man in the organization. R.C. Buford might be the general manager, but he answers to Gregg Popovich. And he's also the head coach of the team. So he has a direct control on players and who plays and who doesn't play. And yet this happened under his watch. And it's virtually impossible to imagine that it could happen without his knowledge.
So what's interesting about that, Amin, is that the lawyer almost opened up his press conference talking about when speaking about this particular case, how Gregg Popovich often talks about issues that are bigger than basketball. And he was pointing the finger right back at him and saying, like, look, this is your organization. You might not be the CEO like R.C. Buford. You might not be the GM like Brian Wright, but you are very much the face of this organization. I would bet the highest paid non-basketball player on the staff. And then he was quick to point out that Dr. Hillary Cawthon tried to reach Popovich about this and went to the GM and said, like, a few months after the initial allegation, she had allegedly a meeting with the GM and said, does Pop know about this? Because she said she had great respect for Popovich and wanted him to know, because she could not believe that he knew about this and that he still believes that this is okay. This is acceptable behavior. And it was relayed to her, that Popovich did know. But the lawyer said, we have every reason to believe that that was a lie, that was not the truth, that Popovich didn't know. And so while I thought that they were going to hammer Popovich on this one, they actually, it seems, are pointing the finger at the people around him, protecting him or insulating him, perhaps as part of a cover-up. Like, if Popovich knows this thing, this blows up. We can't have Popovich know. And that was the picture that they painted, was that Popovich actually had no idea. Now, gets back to Mark Cuban about the workplace issues, the misogyny, and all of that happened in the Dallas Mavericks. Is like, how can you honestly say you had no idea that this was going on? Josh Primo was the number 12 pick for the San Antonio Spurs in 2021. They picked up his third-year option, right? It was third-year option, right?
Third-year option, yeah.
Which would be $4 million approximately.
4.3.
That they were going to pay him. They picked up that option in early October, and then this explodes. This just blows up a few weeks later. So they knew something was happening, or the GM knew something was happening. And then they waived him without releasing a substantial statement or explaining what was happening. So did Popovich know? I think that's going to be something he's going to be asked here. I don't suspect that the Spurs will hide Popovich, much in the same way the Nets have hid Kyrie Irving. But that is something he's going to have to, and the Spurs have to answer for, is like, how much did Gregg Popovich know about this? And why didn't he know if he did not know? Because that's what the picture that she's painting here.
It just kind of, you two have lived more inside of like the NBA world. It just begs the question at times of the kind of normal human interaction and where you handle something that comes across behaviors of humans, bad things that are happening, good things that are happening, in a very like common sense way. And it feels like our sports world, and in this case, we're looking at the NBA because there's a lot of stories just simmering in the NBA now. Maybe you get too much money, too big, all of that, and like common sense just isn't a thing as much for you anymore, because this did not have to be a huge, huge issue. right? Like we go back to all the time. Like the cover up is worse than the crime itself.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the worlds you've lived in, where is the common sense when it comes to the human resources side of things, the structural side of basketball franchises? Because I think it was like 4 or 5 Meadowlarkers ago. I mean, I think when we were talking about the Boston Celtics, we got into a lot about how, the head coach might be in charge of the coaches and of the players are kind of under him, but like he's not leading the marketing side. He's not leading the sales side, the business side. And like there is the structural hierarchy of an NBA organization that is sort of outside of the public eye. But I mean,
Right.
within these worlds right now, I'm like, is the NBA just too much money and they've kind of lost sight of just common sense behavior patterns at this point?
Well, I think it's the opposite. I don't think they've lost sight. It's the opposite. They've never had sight of it to begin with. Right? These are you started it, Kate, actually at the beginning of this episode. You said the NBA gets a pass because they have been so progressive in so many ways, including the hiring and diversification of its workforce, both along racial and gender lines. But that comes against the backdrop of not having the infrastructure. So it's like, oh, no, we got a bunch of women in here and even a bunch of women in high positions of power. All right, cool. Our work is done, but we've done nothing to ensure their safety or their respect, really, is what we're talking about within this construct. We've just shoved them into this environment that hasn't evolved at all to be willing to accept them. And so all of that is what we're talking or what we're seeing in these different instances. We're seeing, a culture that was design makes it seem intentional, a culture that evolved around the dearth of like diversity of gender. And so now it hasn't caught up to the reality of the hiring department. And now what the Spurs have painted themselves into the corner and the Celtics did also is this concept of, oh man, that isn't right. And we shouldn't be doing that. Also though, I don't want to completely cut off my nose to spite my face, right? In essence, that's their thought process, right? Like, he is a pretty good coach or he is a pretty good prospect. And so we get into these dueling vanities. One of we're a good organization that cares about people and does things the right way. And also, but this guy's really good and really important. So is there any way we can just make it go away and pretend it didn't happen and hope that solves it? That's the end of that. It was one time and that's it. It's 2 times and that's a 3rd time. I swear to God, that's it. And what we see with the Spurs specifically in this situation is it reached a critical mass where they realized not that it wouldn't stop. They realized we can't keep it a secret. We can't fix it. And at that point, you try to get ahead of it. And I mean, think about how many people applauded the Spurs. That's how you do it. You just cut ties with someone who does that awful behavior. And they didn't wait for that other shoe to drop, which is, they did it because they had this entire calendar of not doing the right thing because they thought they could make it go away.
Yeah. I mean, there might not be a business that has wonkier power dynamics than professional sports.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you've got, you sort of like fly on the wall inside of a session between Dr. Hillary Coffin and Joshua Primo, and you're like, okay, by all intents and purposes, she's an established mental health professional. I don't know. I'm just making up her age. Let's say she's 35 or 40.
That was another weird thing. That the lawyer for Joshua Primo was insistent on pointing out multiple times that she's 40 years old and that she was preying on a young teenager. And it's like, well, so like if she was 21, it would have been okay. Like what is that about? Yeah, sorry.
Or maybe he no, that's a good point, Tom, because I think it's setting up this idea of like part of what he's hinting at, maybe, I guess in some reading between the lines, it's like, I don't know, is she considered right too old for him? Why would he have exposed himself to a 40-year-old, right?
Yeah.
Well, that makes no sense. I mean, it was part that, and then maybe part trying to switch the power dynamic around in retrospect. Like, well, she was 40 and she was seeing him for past trauma. Therefore, the power dynamic was she had power over him because
Over
she was
him.
treating him. And you could see that happening with what the lawyer was trying to say, but it gets back to this, you know, to the heart of just, if we're looking right now at the NBA, I'm like, I can't think of wonkier power dynamics, because you've got, Primo. I mean, I don't know the Spurs list off the top of my head. I mean, Spurs roster off the top of my head, like y'all do, but like, might he be the 8th most powerful person in that organization?
Right.
I-
Well,
I-
they picked up his option, and then with knowing all of this history, that there were issues continually, and they what she accuses the Spurs of is essentially pushing her out of the organization and saying at one point, you're going to sit this out. And meanwhile, while she is speaking, I mean, I had my laptop open to her speaking and holding back tears, recounting how she tried to get the Spurs to do something and to make an appropriate workplace environment where this was not okay. And she was getting emotional, recounting the management side, and just like how she tried to do the right thing and tried to bring it to the powers that be, and then was silenced, right? Essentially moving you aside.